Well, with that wonderful introduction, and I have been given many introductions in my career, let me start. Let me thank René von Schomburg for inviting me. He invited me to this. Let me give you some, what I'm going to do here, because I'm sort of assuming you probably don't know about the context in which this kind of issue arises, and it is actually one that's very close to René's heart, because what I argue in these last three books, which have been about what I call humanity 2.0, in other words, where do we go from here? And here, the term transhumanism is important because transhumanism was a term that was coined in the 1950s by Julian Huxley, one of the founders of the modern evolutionary synthesis in biology. And one of the things that he was very concerned about was if you take Darwin very seriously, then there is a question about what exactly is different about human beings from all other animals, given that we are all governed by the same principles of natural selection, genetic variation, and so forth. And so Huxley's answer was that basically we are the only creature who does not merely obey evolution, but we know it. Okay? And that knowledge then gives us a kind of distinctive position, you might say, in the process, because in a sense we can sort of operate on it from the outside in the way in which other species cannot. This was his view, articulated in the 1950s. And I don't know how much you would know about someone like him, but he was someone who was in fact a defender of eugenics. And the key point about eugenics here is the idea that the human condition can be substantially manipulated and transformed by human beings. I think that's the key point about eugenics to sort of keep in mind as a kind of precursor to transhumanism. And so what I want to say at the outset here is that the kinds of things that I'm talking about are about how do we reassert human exceptionalism in a period in which the traditional justifications for being human have been undermined empirically through Darwinian biology. And let us operate on the assumption that we cannot directly go back, in any kind of straightforward way to something like, the Christian idea that we're created in the image and likeness of God, unlike other animals. So there's a sense in which, insofar as we want to defend human exceptionalism, there is an issue on the table here. Okay, given what we know about science, and that the more and more we learn about biological science, the less and less of a difference our species is from other animals in terms of sheer capacities. Okay, whether we're talking about intellectual capacities and so forth. Because when we talk about even things like cognitive superiority, other animals are better than us in other respects. And so it's quite easy to adopt the kind of relativist standpoint with regard to all species if you're a Darwinist. So the question is, insofar as human beings matter more than other creatures, then there's a sense in which we have to kind of reinvent what this is about. And so Huxley, with the idea of transhumanism, was basically saying, look, knowing how evolution works actually is a qualitative difference from just obeying it. And it opens up all sorts of opportunities and capacities that obviously, are very tricky and difficult, etc., but nevertheless need to be pursued if we are going to continue to assert our exceptional status as a species in the future. So this is what I think transhumanism is ultimately about. It is about the reassertion of human exceptionalism. And this is why René is absolutely, there is a sense in which what we're talking about is defending human beings. But what does defending human beings mean in this context, especially as we look forward to the future? Because I do think one of the problems that we face at the moment is that when we think about, as it were, defending humanity, we have an overly precautionary attitude toward it. Okay? And this is where René comes in, because he is the great maestro of the precautionary principle. In fact, he probably has done the most to make this part of policy, certainly in this part of the world, more than anyone else has. Right? And the people who in a sense, whose views I share and have been articulating in a way much more than the originators have, we're part of the proactionary principle. So there's a divide here, okay? And this is what the talk, in a sense, is about. And so what is the divide about? The divide is ultimately about attitudes toward risk. right? Whether risk is a threat or an opportunity. That's the basic point, right? And the precautionary principle basically treats risk as a threat. And so you have to protect people, okay? Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with protecting people, okay? But I'm saying insofar as this becomes sort of your guiding normative principle, I think the people on my side of the argument believe this is really no more than, treating people as endangered species like you would any kind of animal. Okay? And that what human beings are about, right, is about extending opportunities, and risk is really the only way in which opportunities arise naturally. Okay? Now this kind of thinking, I mean, I'm not going to deny this kind of historical lineage, but certainly when people were making the argument initially for capitalism as a kind of empowering and liberating form of social life that went beyond what had existed in the traditional hereditary-based cultures of Europe and throughout the world, the argument was about that, okay, that in a sense human empowerment was at stake in allowing people to explore opportunities that wouldn't be able to otherwise, and so the legal system needs to be in some sense detached a bit from hereditary entitlement. You have to allow people to explore things. Okay? Now, socialism comes in on the back of this, not to deny it, but to provide, as it were, a kind of, how do you ensure that people are actually able to do this in a fair and equitable way? But it isn't a denial of this kind of principle. And so if you look at the main successful socialist politics throughout the world, it also has been proactionary. Okay? And here I would include most of the Marxist governments. They have brought people. But one of the things, of course, that you can see through both the history of capitalism and socialism is, in fact, that there's a lot of hurt, a lot of damage, there's a lot of error, there's a lot of mistakes along the way. And in this respect, the proactionary principle says, no pain, no gain. Right? And this is kind of the thing that's opened up by the idea of risk as opportunity. Right? Not all opportunities pan out. Some of them fail. And then the question becomes, how as a society do we cope with that prospect as always being in our horizon? Right? In other words, how do you enable people to live with failure? Right? To live with the fact that not everything comes true. It seems to me this is the question, as it were, for a welfare state or any kind of society. This is the issue. But it is not to stop people from taking risks. Okay? And so this is where the proactionary principle begins by sort of stressing stressing risk as a positive thing, and then, in a way, think about the negative aspects as a kind of auxiliary issue rather than the main issue. Okay? So this is kind of what the debate is about. Now, the difference, the proactionary principle was invented in 2004. It was coined by a transhumanist thinker who now, as it turns out, happens to be the CEO at Alcor, which is the big cryonics mecca. If you know about cryonics, is the idea like after you die, we put you in deep freeze, and then we resurrect you at some point in the hope of enabling you to live forever, at least curing whatever diseases or disabilities you have, okay? That to be sure, that is one part of transhumanism. I don't particularly think that's great, but it is actually legally possible because when you're dead, from a legal standpoint, it doesn't matter what you do with the body, okay? But I think that's why it flourishes so much, because we can't actually intervene in human beings while they're living to try to enhance them more. The only way we can deal with it is kind of capture them just after death and hope for the best in the future. But in any case, Max Moore, who is the CEO of Alcor, coined this this phrase, the proactionary principle, as part of a manifesto document that included lots of people who I think, some of you may have heard of and in a way signed up to this, Ray Kurzweil, for example, right? Mr. Singularity, uploading consciousness and then we go on forever in silicon form, that kind of thing. But also, some of the artificial intelligence pioneers, such as Marvin Minsky, also signed up to it. You may know perhaps of Aubrey de Grey, this British guy now located in California, who tries to promote research that actually undoes aging, right, and enables people, so that the natural deterioration of your genes don't actually happen, or some perhaps can repair themselves or something like that, so you can remain 40 forever. My apologies to people who are younger than that, but usually this is the market to which it appeals. But the point is, all these are very influential thinkers in the transhumanist movement, and they all signed up to this in 2004. And why did they do this manifesto? Well, it was because George W. Bush put out the first report of his bioethics panel. You may remember that, and that was the one that banned federally funded stem cell research in the United States, right? So stem cell research, of course, continued to be funded in the United States, but not through the federal government, okay? And this was because of a report that had a lot of broadly, what the transhumanists call bioconservative thinkers. That is to say, thinkers who believe that, as it were, there's a kind of a biological limit, there's a kind of a natural zone in which human development can occur and human progress can occur. And if you go beyond that point, then in some sense you're violating what it means to be human. In other words, it is entirely possible that you could, in a sense, extend human life, but do it in a way that actually violates human dignity. Okay? And these people, Leon Kass, who's a kind of a, again, I don't want to go into the heavy philosophy of this, but, sort of neo-Aristotelian professor who kind of believes that there is a human nature in a very strong kind of sense, and he believes that a lot of the kind of instinctive responses that people have to a lot of this innovative research, what gets called in the bioethics literature the yuck factor, namely, this idea that you can grow organs from cells, which is what stem cell research basically does, right? It turns any cell into an organ farm. All right, this is like gross. This is like science fiction. This is not really what it means to be human. And that those intuitions, which of course a lot of people have, and maybe most people in this room have, you want to grant that somehow ontological weight. Right? You want to say that this is somehow registering something that draws a line between what it is to be human and non-human. Now, of course, the Proactionary Principle is about denying all this, right? And so this is the context in which the Proactionary Principle first gets established in this manifesto statement in 2004. Now, what is the argument for this? Well, the argument isn't just that you can imagine that we could be other than we are, but the argument is that, in fact, the history of science and technology shows that we have really kind of moved the sort of default position of what counts as normal for human existence quite far away from the way it was 40,000 years ago when our brain in its basic state got developed, okay? In other words, we have done a lot. We have transformed ourselves in a very substantial way in terms of life expectancy, in terms of our reach, in terms of what we know, in terms of what we aspire to. All of these things have been done, and they have been done through science and technology, and actually, when you look at it in the long term, against the so-called common wisdom of the times in which these things were happening, okay? And I have to say that another thing that I think informs the Proactionary Principle Manifesto is this idea that people are we're getting more and more reluctant to actually do very adventurous scientific research on human beings and increasingly even on animals. Right? So insofar as we have a lot of heavy ethical regulations and guidelines on what can be done, where even the issue of consent doesn't matter anymore. In other words, I, as someone who holds a PhD and reads up on a certain area, I cannot actually legally volunteer to be part of an experiment, right? That is actually very, severe with regard to the prospects to what can happen to my human condition. The only cases where that kind of stuff is even thought about seriously is in very extreme biomedical situations, okay? But not in normal situations. And so the argument that is made in the Proactionary Principle Manifesto is, had these ethical regulations been in effect over the last 300 years, we would never have made much progress in science. Okay, so when a lot of people I mean, if you think about the sort of the range of thinking that's involved in terms of the future of science and technology policy, there is a group of people coming from many different fields who say, well, we're not making as much progress as we used to in the past. That there's some kind of tapering off taking place, and one of the reasons that might be cited for doing that is actually it becomes harder and harder to do the kind of adventurous research that actually leads to the great quantum leaps in knowledge. Okay? But again, all of those experiments that were done in the past were also kind of no pain, no gain things. So no one's saying that those experiments didn't harm people or, cause damage and so forth. But now, in a sense, we're so sensitive to this, especially in light of World War II, right? And obviously the Nazi experience, I think, really colors the entire thinking about this matter, that people have become very reluctant to raise this issue again on the table, even though we are living in a period where people, not just through education, but through their voluntary trying to find out about stuff on the internet, there's more information available that people now actually want to get more and more involved in the development of science and technology and are actually quite willing and happy to put themselves through all kinds of situations, but the ethics doesn't allow it. Okay, so this is, I think, quite, part of the worldview, the background, against which something like the Proactionary Principle gets established. Okay, and so there's an issue here about what it means, what will it mean to be a human being in the future? And I guess this issue is of some relevance here in the context of the European Union, because there is a question about what the state does in this, right? Or what the superstate does in this, if I may use that phrase that is somewhat demonized in some parts of the European Union, but I'm happy to use it. I think, why not? If you're going to have a European Union, it might as well be a superstate, right? I mean, the question is, what kind of role does this kind of entity have in something like this? Because one of the political problems that I think, in a way, it's not just a problem of political rhetoric, but it's also a problem of principle on the part of some of the people who defend the proactionary principle, is that they're radical libertarians. And to my mind, okay, if any of you are sympathetic to the kinds of things I've been saying, that namely there's a sense in which the human imperative there's a kind of imperative for human beings to make progress and to kind of go as far as they can beyond what they're born with, et cetera, et cetera. If you believe in that kind of idea, the problem is that the people who are most adamant about defending it at the moment are libertarians. Okay? And of course, libertarians want to do this in a completely free zone, right? And they usually attach this kind of a notion with the idea of, minimum taxes and minimum state regulation altogether, and what ends up being a rather antisocial kind of approach to things. And there have been many films that kind of in a way provide the dystopian future that's involved. I mean, you think about Elysium, for example, a recent film. There are ways of portraying this, and this is, I think, the main problem in a way with the proactionary principle, which is one of the reasons why, Veronica and I wrote this book, The Proactionary Imperative, because we actually want, as it were, a socialized version of this. Okay, and that's kind of where we're coming from on this, and why do we need a socialized version of this? Well, because historically, actually, the state, and Hegel in a way is kind of the poster boy for this idea, which may be a plus or a minus in this context, I'm not sure, but the idea that it is actually the state through its legal arrangements and the forms of society it makes possible and kind of nourishes, actually allows people to go beyond what they would normally be. That there is a kind of progressive, a kind of push with regard to the state. It seems to me that this is kind of where we need to talk about this matter, especially in terms of science and technology, because I think there still remains, at least for the time being, the idea that science and technology is, at least in principle, in the first instance, of public good. And so that even though there are scientists and technologists who are, as it were, trying to game the system and trying to go into the private realm to benefit certain people rather than others and so forth, nevertheless it is seen as kind of that there is a public obligation, that this is knowledge for everyone, ought to be used for everyone's benefit, and so forth. And here the state actually plays a very important role. And so it's not by accident, I think, that in 2002, so even before, this kind of proactionary principle gets formalized, you have this big report that comes out from the U.S. National Science Foundation, which is then later mimicked by the European Union, on converging technologies and human enhancement. Okay? Because that's basically the code in the policy circles under which this kind of stuff we're talking about operates under. Okay? And part of what was going on in that document, which I think was very important in kind of making this stuff a kind of realistic policy possibility, was the idea that as a result of the end of the Cold War, the science base, the science and technology base, was dissolving from a public standpoint because there was no longer the national security concern. So then the question becomes, and given all the deficits and all the problems that governments have in making ends meet, what was going to be the kind of vision, right? It's not just, as it were, the kind of Cold War, war without end, we have to outsmart the opponent thing, but there has to be some other kind of large-scale vision that would actually justify the massive amount of public support for science and technology that would enable it to keep at its current funding levels and actually to provide employment for all the people who have actually training in this area. And that was the original context from the United States standpoint. Now, when it moves into the and when you bring it into the European context, what becomes even more evident, it's already there in the American context, but it becomes more evident in the European context, is that there are all kinds of policy issues where this ends up feeding into. And I was talking a little bit to Renee about this coming over here, namely pensions crisis. People are retiring too early, in a sense. They're living like 25 years longer than the retirement age was, when it was pegged in 1890. And they're not living necessarily healthier existences. And so there is a kind of cash flow problem with regard to how you're going to fund pensions in the future. Okay? But if you actually had healthy-bodied people who were able to work longer, right, you would be able to sort of solve that problem if you raise the retirement age 5, 10 years, etc. And people actually got used to the idea that it was normal to live longer and live more productive lives in that fashion. Okay, so there's a kind of policy issue there, and there are a lot of other things as well that could be added into it. But the point is, however kind of speculative a lot of this kind of proactionary stuff may appear, nevertheless, it is gradually feeding into policy agendas as a way of ensuring that that actually the kinds of stuff that people already expect about their lives are going to be maintained. And the difference is that it isn't any longer about just, changing income or changing the environment, but it's actually changing the way people operate in their own bodies. Okay? It seems to me that there is a climate of opinion that is more open to this. And indeed, there's even with regard to issues concerning, I think one thing to track in terms of thinking about this issue is what people think about the surveillance versus privacy thing and how that tracks, because the idea that, people might actually make more and more of their information available to them, the key issue isn't that fact alone, right? The key issue is whether they get anything back in return. Okay, so in other words, people are quite happy to provide all kinds of information, but do they get anything back in return? And so this idea that, we're knowing more and more about how people operate, and so then there are more and more possible levels for there to be intervention in how people are, but the key thing is going to be whether the people themselves agree to that to happen. And I think at the moment what we really suffer from is a kind of power asymmetry. Okay? In other words, there's a lot of concern, quite justifiable, that if you actually open up the market for people to experiment and for people to give out their information generally, that only a few people would benefit from it. That is the main problem. The problem is not the fact that we are having a kind of trying to have an open borders policy with regard to human information, but it's just that only relatively few people benefit from it. And I think this is the issue relating to the proactionary principle that needs to be addressed most directly. Okay, not trying to protect people, not trying to, shelter them from the worst effects of things and things like that necessarily, but rather to ensure that whatever people volunteer, whatever happens to them, whatever they do, they end up actually not being so harmed that they can never kind of function again. And so in the book that Veronica and I have written, and I think maybe I should stop here, that we talk about that we're going to need a kind of much more sophisticated form of social insurance, it seems to me, and also issues of compensation and so forth. But one of the things that I think is part of a very key platform to what we're arguing for is the idea that we should start to think about a volunteer experimentation in science, maybe even self-experimentation, but certainly experimentation in licensed scientific laboratories and so forth, should be regarded kind of on the same level of something like jury duty or participation in the military conscription, something of that kind. Namely, it is something where one actually is contributing to a larger common public good, and so that even if one is harmed in the process, it will be respected, it will be valorized, and so forth. And if you think about the way in which we deal with soldiers, right, it seems to me this is kind of the model that we want to be working toward, rather than the way we have at the moment, where the ethical regulations end up kind of encouraging citizens to think about science and technology as a kind of enemy until proven otherwise. Right? If those scientists come in wanting to experiment and think, whoa, I need protection. I need to look at the fine print, right? So in other words, there's a kind of the precautionary principle, however pro-science it may be in terms of how it justifies its arguments, the precautionary principle creates a kind of default negative expectation with regard to science and technology, which then has to be overcome. And it seems to me that insofar as human beings have reached where they are today and have reasserted their exceptionalism the way it has been because, in fact, people have opened themselves to science and technology. And that is to say, we have to open ourselves to it with open eyes. But nevertheless, that is kind of the way to go, and we need to design our societies to enable that to happen rather than to discourage people from doing so. And I think at the end of the day, this is going to boil down simply to an issue of power relations. That is to say, a serious worry that only a few big corporations, influential people will benefit from this prospect. But if the equitability of this can be guaranteed, then this is actually the way to go, and we should start thinking about our societies organized in this kind of risk-seeking, risk-friendly kind of fashion, and that's what the proactionary principle is about. Thank you.